All right, hello again. So in this video, we're going to go over RAW files and then also RAW files in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. So RAW files and Adobe Camera Raw are two different things. RAW files are RAW files from your camera, assuming it shoots RAW files. Most dedicated cameras can shoot, or I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them can shoot RAW files. A lot of cell phone cameras can shoot RAW files now too if you turn it on. And then Lightroom overview, but I only say this because the Camera Raw controls are pretty much the same, not identical, but pretty close to the same as they are in Lightroom. So if you know Adobe Camera Raw, the controls, the editing in Adobe Camera Raw, you also probably know them in Lightroom and even mobile Lightroom. Lightroom Classic, Lightroom, all the different versions of stuff. So let me zoom in a little bit so you guys can see this a little better. So RAW files have many advantages. You can white balance them after they're shot. So you've probably already seen a video on white balance. You've probably already seen a video talking about RAW files, right? So when you're shooting RAW files, you're shooting an image that has all the data from the image sensor in your camera. It's not processed yet. It's not cooked yet, right? So if you're shooting JPEG, then your camera or your phone or whatever is processing the image already and kind of giving you what it thinks you want. But a RAW file is just all the raw data from your camera. So they may not look as good at first, but you have a lot more data to work with. So they have more dynamic range. That means they have more data per pixel, and they can see more information in the shadows and highlights and that kind of thing. That's one of the main advantages. I'll show you that in a few minutes. When you're editing in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, it is non-destructive, meaning you can make changes, but it's not really changing your original file. So you can't really ruin it. Well, I guess you could if you really tried. You're not going to do that, right? But yeah, it's non-destructive, meaning you can do what you want to it, and then you can change your mind and go back and do other things. Couple things about when you are working with Camera Raw file or RAW files. There's two ways to do it, or maybe more than two, but the two that we're talking about. When you edit the image, you're going to get what's called the sidecar file. It's called an XMP file. And you'll see it has the same name as your image, but it'll have .xmp at the end. That's kind of the instructions that you gave Lightroom or Camera Raw to do on your file, but it's separate from your file. So remember I said it's non-destructive, right? So this file has whatever you did, like your processing instructions, kind of that way. You can also do what's called a DNG file. It's a digital negative file. If you do that, you're going to have one file, and that's going to be your new file with the instructions embedded in it. So you can have two files, which is your image and your XMP, or a DNG file, which is one file. I know that makes no sense, right? But we'll look at it, I think, in a minute. You can process other types of files, not just RAW files like JPEGs, etc., using the same controls. But you won't have as much image data to work with. So a JPEG is already cooked, right? It has less, also has less data per pixel, less storage for the values in the pixel, if you want to think about it that way. So it's kind of done-ish, right? You can still process it, and you can still use it in Camera Raw, which I'll show you. But yeah, you'll have more to work with if you shoot in RAW and leave it as RAW, and then work with it that way. So some of the disadvantages and advantages and disadvantages and challenges and things like that. Each camera manufacturer has their own RAW format. So you may see NEF. So here's the files we're going to look at. These are NEF files. That's Nikon's format. You may see AC2. I think that's Canon. They all have a different one. So that's kind of a little disadvantage. They do have to be processed. Well, they don't have to be, but they kind of have to be processed for you to do something with them. So if you want to put them on a website, you can't leave it as a RAW file. You have to change it into a JPEG or something else. So they're not really processed yet. When you're shooting JPEGs in a camera or a camera phone, they are kind of done. You could take them and you could do stuff with them. You could print them. You can put them on a website, stuff like that. For that reason, JPEGs might look better at first. So a lot of your cameras will allow you to shoot both at the same time. You can shoot a JPEG and the RAW file at the same time. Why would you do that? So that you have a JPEG and it's kind of done, and you have an image that you could immediately work with, but you also have the RAW file if you want to go back and do something fancy with it. Get super fancy. JPEGs are processed in the camera, yeah. And I already said this, editing cameras with RAW is non-destructive. Look, I'm already getting redundant. So let's move on. All right. So I've got a bunch of images here. I'm just going to use them to kind of show you generally give you a super quick lightning tour of Camera Raw and maybe do a little bit of processing. So most of these are raw files. The NEF is the raw file from, like I said, a Nikon camera. There are a couple of JPEGs in here as well. And I even have some raw files from, this is from an iPhone. So iPhones and other phones, not just iPhones, can shoot raw files. You kind of have to turn that on. One of the disadvantages, which I didn't list, should have put it on here, Mark, why didn't you do that, is raw files are going to be bigger than a JPEG file. They take up a lot more space. So if you shoot a ton of raw files, especially on a phone, you're going to fill up, well, you might not fill it up, but you're going to fill it up faster, let's put it that way. So that is one sort of negative with raw files, is they do take up more space. Yeah, forgot to mention that. Okay, so let's just open one of these. I'm going to go with this one. And how do you open a raw file? That's a good question. So I'm in Bridge. You probably noticed that, right? It says Adobe Bridge. So if it's a raw file in Bridge, if I double click, it just opens in Camera Raw. And you can see this, it says Camera Raw at the top. One thing I also didn't mention is you can get to Bridge, or you can get to Raw, or Adobe Camera Raw, that's the app. You can get to Adobe Camera Raw from Photoshop or Bridge, and it's kind of the same, like I said, it's the same processing algorithms and controls that are in Lightroom. So there are multiple versions and you can get to them different ways. You can even run two at once, I think. I don't really do that, but anyway, if it's a raw file, if it's just a plain old raw file, if I double click it in Bridge, it goes, oh, well, you want to open that in Camera Raw, and then Bridge opens Camera Raw. You don't even have to have Photoshop open. They're kind of related, right? But you don't really have to have it open. If I double click a JPEG, here's a JPEG, right? If I double click a JPEG, what does it do? It opens in Photoshop instead. So now we're in Photoshop. Let me close this this guy here. So if you just double click a JPEG, it opens in Photoshop. You can open a JPEG in Camera Raw though. So if I go here, instead of double clicking, if I right click and say open in Camera Raw, then it opens that JPEG in Camera Raw. So you can work with it there. One more thing I should probably show you is while we're talking about JPEGs, if I double click this this JPEG, now I'm in Photoshop again, right? I just double clicked and it's in Photoshop. It's not in Camera Raw, but there is a way to kind of use Camera Raw tools in Photoshop. So I'm just going to do this real fast, and you can watch this in slow-mo if you want to look at it later. But I'm going to right click on this image here. This is the actual image. It's called background. It's the background layer. And I'm going to say convert to smart object. Some of you guys have had some of the Photoshop classes, know what that is, but that basically means it's going to sort of make this so it's an object that we can do things to, but it's also non-destructive. Kind of makes it like Camera Raw. So I'm going to say convert to smart object. And you'll get this weird little icon here. It looks like a little icon, a little document icon. Image doesn't look different, but it is now has a non-destructive quality to it. So if I go up to filter here, if I go up to filter, and look, there's Camera Raw filter. So this looks and is just like Camera Raw. So you can do Camera Raw stuff, and I'm not going to really do anything on this image, but let's say I'll bring the highlights down and shadows up. There, I did something to it, right? But I'm going to say, okay, I just did a couple things. I'll show you what that stuff was in a minute. But I'll say, okay. Now down here it says Smart Filter, and it says Camera Raw Filter. And I have made an adjustment. So if I click on the eyeball, if you know this about Photoshop, if you click on the eyeball, it hides and shows layers and effects and things. So there's the original, and there it is after I adjusted it. I didn't do a good job, but I just wanted to show you that you can do Camera Raw in Photoshop using the Camera Raw filter, which is right there. All right, that's enough of that. Enough about JPEGs, because we're kind of talking about raw files. So I'm going to go out of this and go back here. All right, so here we have an image. I'll just use this one. I think these are the same. I'm going to double click, and it opens in Camera Raw. Now I'm in Camera Raw in Adobe Camera Raw. I'm not in Photoshop. So you'll see a film strip here down at the bottom. You can hide and show that right here. You can also zoom down here, or you can see the zoom. To zoom in and out, just like Photoshop, you can do Command plus and minus. So a lot of the controls are same, Command 0 to, or Control. When I say Command, On a Mac, it's Control on a PC. There we've got our image, right? And then we've got all our controls. So they've kind of moved things around here in the last year or two. Used to be all these tools were up at the top. Now they're kind of down the side. I think you can probably rearrange that, but we'll just leave it the way it is. So hopefully it's that way for you. So up at the top, you might see it like this. You might see it different ways depending on the last way you had it open. I could reset the view, but it's probably fine. So up at the top, you have edit. You could say auto, and it's just going to do an auto edit, and we're done. That's actually pretty good. But yeah, there is an auto button there, and there's also a black and white button if you want to change it to black and white. But we're not going to do auto, but I'm going to show you around a little bit. So if I uncheck that, you see it goes back and forth. Then you've got a profile. You can probably just leave that alone unless you want to change it. Maybe I could change it to landscape. I could if I want to. I'm not going to worry about that right now. If I click right here, there's also a lot more profiles. I'm not going to get into that. But that is a place that you can start with. Some people, when they process in Camera Raw, they click on a profile, which we already have, landscape, and then they go from there. So I'll leave it on landscape, sure. And then you've got, let's see, 8, 9 categories of stuff down here. Basic, curve, detail, color mixing, color grading, optics, geometry, effects, and calibration. Sounds like we're on work for SpaceX or something, right? And then over here on the right, you have your tools. And I'll go through these real quick. Like I said, this is a lightning quick intro. You'll see other stuff on Camera Raw, of course. Since this is what you're going to use most of the time to process your photographs. Make them look better, right? So underneath basic, there is a white balance tool. So I'm going to click on this little eyedropper here. And if you roll over, by default, if you roll over a lot of tools and things in Camera Raw, it will give you a little pop-up. Like if I roll over the name of it here, I think it'll do it. Yeah, there we go. And if you wait for a second, it'll give you like a little pointers about the tool. So that's kind of good. It'll tell you what it does. If I go exposure, it's the brightness. And you can see the slider and it'll kind of show you. So that's kind of cool. Helps you out. So I'm going to click on this white balance tool, which is right here. And then I will click on something that should be neutral, meaning it's not a color. Well, it's shades of gray. Let's put it that way. I'm going to click on the clouds. That kind of worked. It's a little bit, looks magenta to me. If I click on things that aren't neutral, you'll get really weird effects. Kind of interesting, but not correct, right? So I'm going to click on the cloud, and that looks pretty good. It looks a slightly magenta to me. So you also have this temperature slider here. I could make it warmer, meaning more yellow, or cooler, meaning more blue, if I want to. And I can also slide from green to cyan, or green to magenta. That is the tint. I don't think I like that magenta tint, so I'm going to put this back to 0. Yeah. I think I'm going to leave it there. But if I want to make this a little warmer, I could go to the right just a tiny bit. And there I've done white balance. And I could use this tool. I can use these sliders. Or I can go under here and say what kind of light it was. I'm going to say it was cloudy. Let's see what that looks like. That's pretty good. It still looks a little magenta to me. So I'm going to slide back on the magenta right there. But anyway, that's white balance. Then you've got a bunch of controls. And these are the controls you're going to use. No, I was going to say 90%. I'm making that number up. I just made it up. 90%. Let's say 90% of the time in Camera Raw, because these are the main kind of controls. That's why they're called basic, right? So exposure is your mid-tone brightness, almost like you change the exposure on your camera. Contrast will make it, the differences between light and dark will get more intense or less intense. So that's contrast, the ratio of light to dark. Highlights are the bright part of your image. So I'm going to go to the right, and it makes the highlights brighter. If I go to the left, it makes them darker. A cool thing that's kind of new up in the histogram here is visible. You can see the different categories. So if I roll, let me zoom in here. If I go up to exposure, there's exposure, shadows, blacks, highlights, whites. That's it, right? So I can also do the same thing here. So if I want to change the shadows, I could just click up here and drag. See, it's doing the same thing as I was doing here. It's not, but it's kind of like a little more visual. So right now I'm bringing the shadows up. And if I click over here and slide this way, I'm sliding to the left. I'm bringing the highlights down. I could have done the same thing here. Just depends what you want to do. So I just brought the highlights down and the shadows up. That's a common thing that you might want to do on landscapes, because then you can see more detail in the sky and you can see shadow highlights in the shadow areas. And like I said before, with a RAW file, that is one of the benefits of a RAW file. There's data in there. If it's a JPEG, there's not going to be as much. So even though we can't see, if I hit P on my keyboard, P is kind of go back and forth between what I've done and how I opened it. You can see this looks black in here. Look at that. Right? It looks black. It looks like I can't see anything in there. Now I can. Oh, there's a tree and stuff. Oh, look, there's Bigfoot. No, Bigfoot's not on Hawaii. This is Hawaii. That would be weird. Maybe you got a vacation. So that is that data's in there, especially if it's a RAW file, and you can get it out with Adobe Camera Raw. That's great, right? Oh, I forgot to mention you can auto. Remember we did auto up here earlier. If I hold down the Shift key, you'll see all these switch to auto exposure, auto highlights, auto, etc. I can click on that. I can hold down Shift and click on auto whites, and then it does the white point for me. That basically makes the brightest part of the image white. And the same thing on black. If I click on that, it's going to make the darkest part of the image black. That gives you a full spectrum of white to black, which usually looks okay. It depends on the image, though. It does depend on the image. I could also do that by double-clicking on, if I double-click on any of these, if I double-click on any of these, it'll go back to 0. That's a good little trick that I should probably tell you guys. All right, so there is the exposure, contrast, highlight, shed. That's a lot of what you can do. Then you've got 3 sliders that are kind of similar, and I'm just going to roll over here and see what it says. Texture, enhance or reduce the appearance of texture. Oh, that makes sense. So if I go to the right, it's going to get more texture. If I go to the left, it's going to get kind of like you need to have your eyes checked a little bit. It's also kind of more towards the highlights, I think, that it affects a little bit in texture. It's going to look for edges and kind of make them more contrasty. That's the way you can think of it. Same thing for clarity, but clarity might be working more in the lower contrast areas. You kind of have to play with it a little bit. So clarity, if I roll over that, what's it going to say? Contrast around the edges. Yeah, it's going to work with the edges. So if I go this way, you see if you go too far, it starts to look kind of radioactive. That's not good. So don't overdo it. But you do generally want to add texture and clarity to landscapes. This is a landscape, right? And then dehaze is supposed to kind of get rid of haze, like atmospheric haze, but it also enhances contrast as well. If I roll over this, it'll say, move to the left to add simulated haze, move to the right to remove haze. But it also adds kind of contrast. They don't really say that, but it kind of does. So I just added a little bit of texture, clarity, and dehaze to all those. The last 2 on here are vibrance and saturation. So vibrance is going to increase the saturation of colors that aren't super saturated already. What is saturation? Saturation is kind of the purity of the color. So if it's got kind of if it's kind of washed out and flat, if you add saturation, it'll get brighter and stronger. Let's think of it that way. And if you go the other way, so I'll just do it here. Here's vibrance going to the left, kind of gets washed out. If I go to the right, it gets more saturated. Vibrance only affects or mostly affects colors that aren't already saturated. So you might see it more in these areas where they're not really saturated. And then the saturation slider is going to be affecting all colors. So if I go to all the way to the left, it's a black and white image. If I go all the way to the right, it's radioactive again. So be careful with those sliders. And these 2 I would put under the category of eye candy. Well, a lot of these are, but what I mean by that is when you see a lot of images in social media or people posting on Instagram or whatever, right? They all have the saturation cranked up because it makes it kind of pop, makes your eyes go wow, right? So just be aware that don't use saturation and vibrance to kind of make your bad image good. I would say it's a hard way to say it, but you don't want to use it to as a crutch, right? Oh, I'll just add some saturation every time and it makes it good. It won't. But it will make it sort of stand out. That being said, you are welcome to use vibrance and saturation. Okay, so that is the basic tools. Those are the main ones that you want to use is under this basic area here. I'm going to just quickly hit a few of these other ones. And this is kind of the order that you go as well. And then we'll see if we have any time to look through some of these tools and things. But I'm going to go to the curve. So the curve is a plot of the contrast in your image. So if it's a straight diagonal line, then every pixel value that's in your image is going to be plotted just like it was in the original image. What do I mean by that? If I make this, it's probably easier to see it if I do it. If I make this into this is called the classic kind of S curve. If I make it an S curve, this gets steeper. Where this gets steeper, this gets more contrasty. That looks terrible. But I wanted to kind of overdo it to show you that. If I select these, I can hit delete and they go away. But that's a way to add contrast. You can also click here and say linear, which is what we already have. You can say medium contrast. It'll do a little medium curve for you. And if you do strong contrast, it'll do a stronger one. Now none of those look good to me, so I'm going to go back to linear since this image is pretty contrasty already. But that is a way to add contrast. You can do a lot of other things in there as well, but that's the curve. Detail, that's where you do sharpening. So by default, there is sharpening on. I think way back in the olden days, like during the gold rush and stuff like that, the sharpening was off in Camera Raw, I think, if I remember right. But now that's going to apply some basic sharpening, which your camera does if it's making a JPEG as well. So you can adjust that if you want. You can raise it. So that's obviously what it sounds like. It's sharpening, right? If I go to zoom in here, I'm going to zoom way in here. And then you can see the sharpening. If I crank it up, I think you can see that. Oh, just back out. There's sharpening up and down. There's also a noise reduction. I think you can see some noise in there. That is noise, I think. So noise is sort of stray pixels of stray brightnesses or stray color pixels from your camera. So if I slide this to the right, you'll see the image might get a little duller, but it tries to get rid of some of that noise. Some people like it and they leave it in, but that's up to you. But that's under detail as well. So sharpening, noise reduction, and color noise reduction are there. There's obviously more to say about all these, but this video is going to be 4 hours long, so we don't want that. There's a color mixer where you can mix colors. I'm not going to get into that one right now, but that is where you can do some stuff there. We're going to skip that. There's also color grading. That is where you can do things like duotones and tritones, where you can make interesting colors out of your images, sort of surreal colors and things like that. You may see a video later on that, or somewhere you'll see something on that. I did want to go to optics because that is something that you will always use. You won't always use these two, but you might always use optics. So if I click on, let me zoom back out. If I click on remove chromatic aberrations, that is a fancy way of saying some cameras will have sort of a purple fringe or a fringe around contrasty areas, and it tries to get rid of that. This is the one you always want to use, probably, is use profile corrections. It's right there. So if I click on that, oh, it looks like Funhouse. So what it's doing is it's trying to correct for the lens distortion. Almost all lenses, maybe all of them, have a little bit of distortion in them. They make weird bendy kind of light things going on. That's technical, right? they distort the shapes of things and the angles and the lines and stuff like that. So if you check that, it will try to correct for that. And it actually, if you're shooting RAW files, it knows kind of that information about what lens was used is in the file. So I didn't tell it this, but Camera Raw knows that this is the lens that was used. If that's blank, that means your lens information is gone, and you can still do it manually here under distortion. But if everything went right and you're shooting RAW files, that information is already in your file. If it's not, you can also try to find it. You can click on make, pick the make of your camera. Well, that's a lot of different camera makes. And the model of the lens, and then see if you can find that lens. That's if it's missing. Normally it's not missing, but that's good. So that's optics. Geometry is for making things straighter. Distortions, other kinds of distortions. I don't think this one really needs it, but let's try it anyway. I'm going to click on that. Maybe it would, maybe it did. So if I click on this is auto perspective corrections. Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, it straightened it as well, which is cool. So that's under geometry. Then there's effects. There's a couple there that you might think about. One's called grain. And if I crank that one up, you see it's adding. It's almost like adding noise. Some people like that look, like I said, so that's where that is. There's also a vignetting tool right here, which you can also do in a different way elsewhere in the app. But if I go to the right, it does a white vignette. Looks like an old movie from the 1900s. If I go to the left, it makes a dark vignette. And a vignette is obviously these darker corners or lighter corners, and they tend to focus attention towards the middle. Used a lot for romantic photographs of couples who are about to get married or babies. That's all they're used for. No, that's not right. Vignetting is a pretty typical thing. Sometimes your lens will do it accidentally, so you have to watch out for that too. Lenses will vignette on their own. But that's underneath effects. And then calibration, you don't really need to worry about too much. Probably, hopefully. But what that means is if your camera has a certain bias towards a certain color, which you may be able to fix in the camera controls too, but if it does, you can change things here. So you could like shift the colors every time, for example, and you can pick your own. Well, that's calibration, but you could shift colors here. But I'm gonna say you don't have to worry about that probably. You can also see now everywhere I did something in Camera Raw, because I didn't do something in all those areas, but it has a little eyeball, right? If I turn that off or I click it, I can't turn it off, but it undoes it, right? Or it turns it off temporarily. Oh man, that's gonna cause a problem. And then geometry. So that's kind of cool. You can see what it did. We are almost done, I think, but I wanted to go through these tools just real fast. One thing before I forget is if I hold down Option or Alt on a PC, if you look down here at the bottom, down there, if I hold down Option, you'll see that the words change. One says open, and then if I hold down Option, it says open copy. So it'll open a copy in Photoshop if I do that. If I click open, it'll just open in Photoshop. I never told you that either, but that's what that does. Done means it's going to close, and then cancel means obviously cancel, it's going to do nothing. But if I hold down Option or Alt and I click on Reset, it will go back to, oops, now I'm zoomed in. Yeah, it'll go back to where we started. So if I click Done, I need to show you that. Oh, we got Photoshop. Let's hide Photoshop. I click Done. There's the original. I mean, that was what it looked like. Here's what it looks like now. This little icon means that it is has some settings on it from Camera Raw. I guess that's the Camera Raw icon for that, right? If I double click it, it'll open, and those settings are still in there. Neat, right? So it's non-destructive as well. So if I go back, let me get out of this. Ugh, I hate you, Photoshop. Get out. I'm going to right click. There's another cool thing you can do. Right click in Bridge and go to Reveal in Finder, or on your computer if you're on a PC. There is the NEF file, right? You see what it looks like in the preview? It looks like the way we started. Here's the XMP file. That's the little tiny little text file. It's only 10 kilobytes. That says all that stuff that I did to make this image look like that. That's the XMP file. So that tells you that you have to have that file, right? So if I take this file out, watch, I'll break this whole thing here. Let me go. I'm going to take this file out, XMP. Oh, I just copied it. Let me delete it now. So I deleted it. Look what happened to that image. It went back to the start. No, I lost my image. I didn't, really. The image is still there. There's the image. I'm going to put that XMP file back. Hopefully that works. Yes, it did. So I just put the XMP file back. Look at the preview changed again. So those are everything that I did in Camera Raw is stored in that XMP file. So don't forget that you need both of those files if you're doing it this way. Now, if it's a DNG, which I don't have, oh, these are DNG files. There's only one file. These are raw files with the editing information embedded in them. That's the DNG. That's what I meant earlier at the beginning of this video 6 hours ago, that this is a one file thing and this is a two file process. That's your raw file. That's your XMP file. If you do it with a DNG, it's all in one. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I'm gonna open this thing back up one more time. just wanted to go quickly through these tools over here, and then I think we'll wrap this up. So we were in the basic tab up here, or it says edit. We have a crop tool where we can crop, obviously, right? There's a bunch of presets here to different shapes if you like fancy shapes. For printing, these are typically printing shapes, right? 5 by 7, 8 by 10, or 8 by 10. 1 by 1 is square for your Instagram squares, although not always square anymore. You can also grab the corner here to crop. You can rotate it. And then if I hit enter, it looks like that. Oh no, there's been an earthquake and everything is sideways, right? But the good thing about this, if I go back to the crop tool, right up here, and I hit escape, look, it's back. So it's non-destructive and crops too. So I can crop to whatever I want, and the image is still there. You haven't done anything to the image. You just said, I want to crop to this shape or whatever. You can also change the angle here in the crop tool. You can double click this guy right there, and it will try to straighten your image. I think it was kind of straight already. Maybe it wasn't, but that is what it, whoa, that's not good. Let's go back to the default. So that's underneath there. You can also rotate and flip and some other things there. There is a healing brush, basically a spot tool. I need to go to a different image. I'm gonna say done on this one, because I think I have an image that has some spots, maybe. Yeah, here we go. Here's an image with some spots. So there's a spot right there, right? You guys see that? It's a big one. If I go to the spot tool, or the healing tool, they have different names for these, but they're basically all the same thing. And then if I make a little bigger, I'm using the square bracket keys. That's just like Photoshop. They're next to your P on your keyboard. I'm gonna zoom in so you guys can see. And I'm gonna make it just bigger than that spot, and click, and it's gone. Well, kind of, maybe it needs to be a little bit bigger. You can move these individual spots around, these circles around. So the red is the spot you're fixing, and the green is the one that you are sampling from, kind of copying from. It's not a direct copy, but it kind of, it takes the color and the texture and things and tries to fix that. If I click on visualize spots, right there, and then I crank this guy over, it will help you see spots. So that might be a spot right there. It looks like a weird painting, right? Yeah, that is a spot. See, that was hard to see before. Right there, that's a spot. If I turn off the visualize spots, it's hard to see, but there is a spot there, so I'm gonna fix that one too. And if you don't like where it's sampling from, you can move this thing around. All that is non-destructive as well, so you didn't really paint or anything on your image. No, you didn't. So there you go. That's the healing tool. I guess it's healing in here. So I'm gonna click done on that one, and this keeps coming back. It's bothering me. Okay, so that is that, and then let's go back to this guy. The next one down is the mask tool, which I think I'm gonna show you in a different video because I know this video is getting too long. But this is a way to do sort of adjustments in certain areas. So that's the mask tool. We'll get back to that one. This one is the red eye tool for devil kids. I shouldn't say devil kids. Kids with red eyes, because hopefully you guys know how that works. But can I zoom in here and still see that? Sort of, not really. So what's going on with the red eye is when you use a flash, typically it's with the flash, the light is bouncing off from the flash off your camera, off literally the retina. It's like you're getting an eye test. It's bouncing off the retina of the person and bouncing back to you, and the retina is all full of blood. Gross, right? So that's what you're seeing. So this is a tool to get rid of that. You just circle the eye with that tool, and it doesn't come up very much. This one is pretty cool. This is snapshot. So if I click on this, it goes to snapshots, which it doesn't show you anything. But if I click on this little guy right here, and I'll say, okay, it saves this version of the image. Now if I go, I'm gonna go 2 steps down here, right here, I'm gonna go reset to default. So that's kind of how I opened it. Yeah, reset to open. Here's how I opened it. Oh no, that's not how I opened reset to default. That's how we started, right? Oh, that's not so good anymore. But I could save that as a snapshot too. I'm gonna click on that. You don't really have to save that one as a snapshot since I can always revert to open, but I'm gonna click on that. I'm gonna call it open or start. Let's call it start so we know what that is. All right, so now I've got 2 snapshots. Look at this, I can just roll over them and see what they look like. You could do as many versions as you want and say like, well, I like this one better, I like that one better. And if you click on it, it goes to that version and all your settings are in there. So it's unlimited, well, I don't know if it's unlimited. It's lots of different versions you could save there. The last thing down here is presets. There are many, let's go to a different image. I'm gonna click done. Let's go to this one. This is the Cliffs of Moher. Yeah, I think this was in Harry Potter. So I'm gonna go to presets here. And let's see, I'll find landscape. And then these are just presets that you can start with if you want, provided by Adobe. So I can click on one of these and then there's my starting point if I want to. You can also save your own presets, which I'll show you later. But, oh, here it is. Create preset. I was trying to remember where that was. Mark 1. And it says user presets. I'll say okay. And I didn't really show you what was in those presets, but it tries to remember the stuff you did. And then now I've got one in there under user presets right here. There's Mark 1. And I can go and roll over these and see what they all look like. These are for portraits. That doesn't make sense for this landscape, but you could. You can do whatever you want. So that's presets. This last thing is a menu down at the bottom, which will let you reset to open, reset to default, previous settings, snapshots, presets, things like that. So when you see this little ellipsis, I think it's called, you can click on that and you'll get different things. One more thing I wanted to show you before we get out of here. Let me click cancel on that because that was a bad edit. If you wanted to do the same, you can open multiple images at once. So I'm gonna click on this in Bridge, hold down Shift and click on this guy and double click. And now all 4 of those images were open. So these are some images I shot for a panorama, which we'll see about later. But I can select all these. I can hold down Shift and select them all here. Now if I go to add texture and clarity and a little dehaze, and maybe a little contrast and bring the highlights down. I'll do auto whites and auto blacks. Add a little vibrance. So I just did a ton of quick edits that are pretty typical for a landscape, but you can see down here, look, they're all done. So you can do these adjustments to multiple images at once. Since these are all gonna go together in a panorama, which is a stitched image, then you can do it that way. Another way I can do it real quick, I'm gonna reset. I'm just gonna select this one and I'll do a couple of same thing real fast. I'm not gonna do much just because I'm showing you. So I did that one. Now this one is processed and these aren't. If I click on all these now and I click on this, wait, sorry, I wanna click on that. I don't know if you guys saw that. I click on this bottom guy here, and it looks like little settings, but it says it's got a little circular. I did something with my hand. You guys can't see that. It looks like it's a synchronize thing command, right? So here's synchronize. I can synchronize the settings between those images. Say okay, and now they're all done again. I know I went super fast there, but I know we're getting long. All right, so that is most of it. The basics anyway. I did leave out where you can see before and after, different ways like that. That is right down here on the bottom right. And there's more that I left out, but I think you got most of it there. So sorry if that went a little bit long, but I wanted you to get a quick overview of Adobe Camera, and you'll see more about some of these details later, but that was the basics. So I'll talk to you again later.